This video was brought to you by Squarespace. I remember in grad school, I had this one meeting with one of my mentors or supervisors, and it was, I think, the time of the year where he was supposed to be giving me feedback. And he just kind of sat me down in his office and he kind of just talked about some of the things I was doing well, talked about the progress I'd made. But then he also stopped and said to me, to be honest with you, Aylin, I do think there's something that you could be working on. And he basically told me, he said, Aylin, you apologize too much. You're often saying, I'm sorry, when often there was no need for an apology. And the second point that is kind of closely related to that, he said, Aylin, you also, I can just tell, you're holding yourself back. You're not saying thoughts that you have or ideas that you have in our group meetings that I know are in there somewhere, that I know you have reactions to some of the studies we're talking about, or you have ideas, but you just kind of stay silent and you don't necessarily share. And he kind of said, I think you're afraid of making some kind of mistake or of saying the wrong thing, or you somehow don't think your voice or your opinion is worthy, so you keep it to yourself. But we want to hear what you're thinking. And what's funny is maybe for you watching this, not knowing the context of the conversation, you might think, oh, well, really, that's just like a backhanded compliment. Really, he's saying like he wants to hear more from you. But I think he was really telling me like this was a problem that was getting in my way, that I was actually lacking and not doing as well as I could as a grad student. I wasn't doing the role I was supposed to do by holding myself back and not sharing. Because part of the point of your role as a grad student in a lab like this is to like come up with ideas and to discuss flaws to experiments and to come up with, better ways to approach a study. And so he was saying like, you need to be contributing more. And I think somewhere in your brain there are ideas, but you're just not sharing them, which was totally true. I was always nervous and intimidated by other people. I had a lot of imposter syndrome, and I just felt like, who am I to give my opinion? I might be totally wrong, especially when it got to a level where it was like high level neuroscience that I honestly didn't understand fully. So I think it was just hard for me to come out of my shell. But now that it's years later and I look back on that experience and that feedback, I think about it a little bit differently. And I finally have realized, I think, what my problem was and what I should have been thinking about differently that would have freed me up to speak my mind. And it's a principle that I now use all the time, not just in being my best self at work or something, but also in how I approach minimalism and decluttering. It is a way of thinking, a lens through which you can look at what you're doing in minimalism and also, just how you're approaching other areas of your life. And so I wanted to share it with you guys to see if it might also help you. Before we get into that though, I want to take a quick break to talk about the sponsor of this video, Squarespace. Squarespace is this all-in-one platform that allows you to build an online presence. I've used it for years and I absolutely love it. That's why when they contacted me to do a sponsorship, I was so excited because this is a platform that I genuinely use. I've used it for years and that I absolutely love. And in this day and age, we often all have a reason to create a website. Like I personally think one of the best things you can do to build a future career is even just to create your own website that is a landing page for people who want to learn more about your experiences. So even if you don't have a specific purpose for it now, I think building a beautiful website that speaks to your experiences can really pay off down the road in ways you might not even imagine now. But it also is such a great place for growing a business or even selling things. It has blogging and commenting features, mailing lists, member areas, scheduling, online stores, everything you might need to build your online presence and run your business. So if you're interested, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/sliceoflight for 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. So essentially, after I got that feedback from my supervisor, I just started thinking about it more and I tried to put myself out there more. but I really struggled with it until I kind of recognized the underlying problem. What I realized was that I was thinking in the short term rather than the long term. I was giving in to the short term fears of shame I might experience if I said something wrong, as opposed to thinking about the long term ramifications of not saying anything. I was so worried that in the moment I might be embarrassed, that I might say something silly or stupid, that they wouldn't trust me or that they would judge me. But I didn't think about the fact that by not saying as much as I could have, I was really digging myself into this big hole, where it then became a bigger deal when I did say something in these meetings. And I also didn't take into account the fact that I wasn't contributing in the same way that I could be. And I was letting those short-term fears of what might happen in the immediate moment outweigh those long-term costs to my behavior. Because if you think about it another way, if I were to just speak up more frequently in those meetings, I might say something stupid once in a while. I might make a fool of myself at times, but there might be other times where I'm really contributing, or at least I'm showing that I'm very engaged in the process and that I'm trying. And maybe at times I might even contribute more than I really realize initially. Because also in these meetings, it was kind of like one idea bounces off another, off another. And so it's really helpful to just have more brains in the room thinking of ideas, even if they're not always the best ideas. And especially since we are looking at trying to improve study design and find holes in our previous thinking or planning, it was important that everybody contributed and brought up things that they were concerned about. But this whole concept translates beyond how you're performing in work meetings. They also relate to minimalism, because so often I find that I'm doing a declutter and I face an object that I'd maybe even forgotten about, but I suddenly remember why I like it or why I used to use it at one point. And then I start to think, oh, well, if I let go of this, I might really miss it. I might a few days or a few weeks or a month down the road think, oh, I wish I had that object because I could use it in this context and it's perfect for that. And it actually has happened a couple of times in the decluttering process where I think about an object I've decluttered and then I kind of regret it and I kind of miss it, but it is far less often than I think. But my point is that initial fear that in the short term I might have regret or I might miss this object keeps me from being able to just rid myself of it, and then I end up having more. And this happens over and over and over again until I'm left with a lot more stuff than I really want. And sometimes it's not even clear thoughts like, oh, I'm going to regret this. Sometimes it's even just like a general feeling of discomfort or unease when I'm thinking about getting rid of something. There might be a lot of different emotions wrapped up in it. Maybe it's guilt, maybe it's anxiety, maybe it's kind of sadness or nostalgia or whatever. There's this feeling that getting rid of this object feels wrong on some level. But that means if I'm basing my decision based off of that short-term fear, I'm not basing it off of the long-term what I want. Like, I'm not thinking about how will it pay off in my life if I actually declutter this object and rid myself of it. Especially if I apply the same principle to a bunch of objects. If I keep keeping them because of this short-term anxiety, rather than accepting that getting rid of more will make me happier in the long run, I'll end up just continuing to have so much stuff and I won't get to where I actually want to be. And so I think it is about thinking more often, what is the long-term result of my actions and my choices here? Forgetting my emotions in this particular moment, how will it impact my emotions in the long run? How will it impact the quality of my life in the long run? And act based off of what's right for you in the long run, based on your values and what you want your life to look like, as opposed to maybe what it feels like in this particular moment. And I know sometimes on some level, we realize that we're just acting on our impulses rather than what we want in the long run, but so often we forget to intentionally think about what we're doing and how it will impact us a year down the road, 3 years down the road, 5 years down the road. You know, honestly, like 5 years down the road, will I care about this particular sweater or t-shirt? Probably not. And it's important to use that long-term thinking to help weigh out how important something is to us. I mean, it's similar to like parenting, I would imagine. It's like sometimes you have to tell your kids what they don't want to hear and they'll be upset about it because you know it's right for them in the long run. Another way to think about this is I think about how I used to give therapy to people with anxiety disorders, and so often the best approach to anxiety is actually exposure therapy, where you're gradually exposing people to their fears so that they habituate to it, so that their anxiety doesn't spike as high as it used to. Because quite often when we have anxiety, we're avoiding, but by gradually approaching the thing that we're anxious about, we find that we're okay. Maybe we do experience more anxiety, but we become more used to that anxiety, or that anxiety gradually over time lessens. So basically, it's like the classic example of if someone has a fear of snakes, you might actually expose them to being around snakes in a safe environment, of course, but like you might start out with going to a zoo and distantly looking at the snake section and then going back until you get closer and closer, or that type of thing. I guess I'm getting a little off topic, but my point is, so often we experience anxiety in the short term that we think is telling us something important when it actually isn't accurate to the situation. And it's just about overcoming by facing those short-term scary emotions and living with them and being okay with feeling some anxiety or trepidation so that you can live out the longer-term values that you want to live. In the case of, someone who has an anxiety disorder around snakes, maybe it's about realizing like, I am afraid to go to a lot of places because I'm just afraid of snakes, but I want to be able to go on hikes. I want to be able to do all these things. But because I'm not facing my short-term fears, I'm not able to do those things. And so I think it's the same thing with decluttering. Like, can you face letting go of an object and the anxiety around that and the fears around regret or guilt around that, so that you can have the long-term payoff of a life with less, a life that's filled up more with experiences, with relationships, with things that you're passionate about, as opposed to stuff. But I will say, I think this spans beyond minimalism. I think it relates to how we approach life and how we spend our time, and are we really living day to day the way we want to be living? And are there fears or anxieties or avoidances that keep us from living the life that we really want to live? I think so often we just get into cycles of habit that have to do with like being afraid to feel those emotions that are a little bit uncomfortable. And so we just think day to day in the short term, and we just get into cycles of habits and routines and behaviors that aren't necessarily reflecting what we actually want and how we want to be spending our time in our life. I think a perfect example of that is probably how much TV binge watching I do. So often just turning on the TV kind of lets me escape from my worries or what's going on. And don't get me wrong, sometimes watching some Netflix really does the trick and just kind of like letting you decompress. I'm all for that, but I think sometimes I use it to not deal with other stuff, and I'm not, actually living the way I want to be living. And so I think there are many ways in life that we can apply this principle of thinking about how do we want to be living in the long term rather than just the short term, and how are our short-term fears getting in our way of that long-term vision. Anyway, that is pretty much all I have for you today. If you enjoyed this video, please give it the thumbs up button. Doing that helps it get out to more people. It's a great way of supporting me, so I would really appreciate it a lot. And remember to check out Squarespace if you're interested in the link below. Thanks so much for taking the time to watch this video, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye.